Venezuela didn't collapse overnight. There was no single crash, no single disaster. Instead, the country was dismantled quietly, one policy at a time. Money printing, price controls, currency controls, sanctions. Each one looked survivable on its own, but together they destroyed an entire economy. In 2012, Venezuela's minimum wage was among the highest in Latin America. A teacher earned enough to feed a family, save for a car, plan for retirement. By 2020, that same teacher's monthly salary wouldn't buy a week's worth of groceries. The currency had become so worthless that people weighed stacks of bills instead of counting them. This is the story of how a wealthy nation became the poorest country in the Americas, how money itself stopped working, how nearly 8 million people, almost a quarter of the population, fled their homeland. And here's what should terrify you. Every step of the collapse was visible years in advance. The warnings were there. The math was clear. But the people in power insisted it couldn't happen, right up until it did. Before the collapse, there was the boom, the illusion that oil wealth made Venezuela invincible. In the early 2000s, under Hugo Chavez, life seemed good. Oil prices were climbing from under $20 per barrel to over $100. Venezuela was flush with cash. GDP tripled. Poverty fell by half. The government spent lavishly. Social programs expanded dramatically. Gasoline was virtually free. A full tank cost pennies. Electricity was subsidized. Food was subsidized. Housing was subsidized. The state was providing, and people believed it would last forever. Caracas, the capital, buzzed with construction. New metros, new housing projects, shopping malls filled with imported goods. For millions of Venezuelans, life was better than it had ever been. But beneath the boom, the foundations were rotting. And here's the first puzzle that should have warned everyone. How does food disappear in a country with oil money? Venezuela was importing food with oil revenue. The farms were there. The land was fertile. But domestic production was falling year after year. Something was making it unprofitable to grow food inside Venezuela, even as demand was rising. That something was policy. But in 2003, nobody was paying attention. Oil revenues comprised roughly 60% of government income. Eventually, oil would reach 96% of export earnings. Venezuela had become a pure petrostate. Nothing else mattered. Agriculture withered, manufacturing declined. The country that should have been diversifying was instead doubling down on the one commodity that made everything work. Private investment fell year after year. Why build factories when you could import everything? Why develop technology when oil money could buy it abroad? The non-oil economy shrank as a percentage of GDP. Venezuelan entrepreneurs left for Miami, for Madrid, for anywhere with better opportunities. The brain drain started during the boom, not the bust. Engineers saw no future in a country where connections mattered more than competence. Scientists left for universities abroad. Businesses closed or relocated. This should have been a warning. In a healthy economy, booming commodity prices attract investment and talent. In Venezuela, even during the good years, capital and people were leaving. And then in 2003, the government made a decision that would come back to haunt them. Price controls. The government froze prices on 400 basic goods: bread, milk, rice, meat, medicine. The idea was simple: keep prices low so the poor could afford necessities. Remember that puzzle from earlier? How does food disappear in a country with oil money? This is the answer. When you fix the price of rice below what it costs to produce, farmers stop growing rice. When you fix the price of bread below production costs, bakeries close. The government thought it was helping. It was creating the conditions for future shortages. But economics doesn't care about intentions. It cares about incentives. That same year, 2003, came currency controls. The government established Khedive, a system that fixed the exchange rate and restricted access to dollars. The official rate was set. The market rate was irrelevant. If you wanted dollars, you had to go through the government, and the government decided who got them and at what price. This created a parallel economy, a black market for dollars, where the real exchange rate bore no relationship to the official fiction. But in 2003, with oil money pouring in, these problems were invisible. Shortages were minor. The black market was small. Everything seemed manageable. Then came the Purge. In 2002 and 2003, after a failed coup and a devastating oil worker strike, Chavez fired 18,000 PDVSA employees. That's 40% of the workforce. These weren't just workers. They were the engineers, the geologists, the technical experts who knew how to extract oil from one of the most difficult reserves in the world. Venezuela's oil is heavy crude, harder to refine, more expensive to process. It requires expertise. Chavez replaced experienced professionals with political loyalists and military officers who had no industry experience. Oil production, which had been 3.2 million barrels per day in 2000, fell to 2.5 million by 2013. It never recovered. This was the hidden cost of the boom. Short-term political control traded for long-term productive capacity. The goose was laying golden eggs, and they were slowly strangling it. By 2014, inflation was already the highest in the region, around 20% that year, climbing. The central bank had been printing money steadily to finance government spending, but oil revenue was still high enough to mask the effects. The government ran deficits during the boom. When oil was over $100 per barrel, when money was flowing in faster than ever, the government spent more than it earned. By 2011, the deficit hit double digits. This is insane. You're supposed to save during the boom so you have reserves for the bust. Venezuela did the opposite. They spent everything, borrowed more, and printed money to cover the gap. The warning signs were everywhere, but they were dismissed. Officials blamed speculators. They blamed economic war. They blamed sabotage. President Maduro, who took over after Chavez died in 2013, insisted the economy was under attack by foreign enemies and domestic traders. The problem wasn't policy. The problem was conspiracy. This denial, this refusal to accept that the model was unsustainable, meant that when the crash came, Venezuela was completely unprepared. This is the moment when everything changed. In June 2014, oil prices began to fall. $112 per barrel dropped to $90, then $80, then $60. By January 2016, oil hit $26, a 70% collapse in 18 months. For Venezuela, this was catastrophic. The government's budget was built on oil at $100. They needed that price to finance spending, to import goods, to maintain subsidies, to keep the system running. When oil collapsed, government revenue fell off a cliff. But spending didn't. The social programs continued. The subsidies continued. The state payroll continued. The gap between revenue and spending exploded. And the government had a choice. Cut spending, which would mean admitting failure and losing political support, or print money to cover the deficit. They chose to print. The central bank, which had lost its independence years earlier, became a printing press for the regime. By 2016, the money supply was expanding 20 to 30% per month, every month. Monetary liquidity increased 135% in 2016 alone. Since January 2013, the money supply had grown by 1,235%. Every new bolivar created diluted the value of every existing bolivar. Prices started rising faster. Inflation hit 69% in 2014, 181% in 2015. By 2016, estimates ranged from 274% to 800%, depending on who was calculating, because by this point, the government had stopped publishing reliable statistics. At the same time, the price controls that had been mild annoyances during the boom became catastrophic during the bust. Store shelves emptied. The government had fixed prices on basic goods at rates that made production unprofitable. Farmers couldn't afford to grow corn at the controlled price. Bakeries couldn't afford to make bread. Stores couldn't afford to stock goods. So they didn't. By 2016, the scarcity index exceeded 50%. Half the products you'd expect to find in a store weren't there. Lines formed at dawn outside supermarkets. People waited hours for rationed goods. Families sent different members to multiple stores, hoping someone would find flour, cooking oil, toilet paper. The basics of life became scarce because the government had made it illegal to sell them at a price that covered costs. The currency controls made everything worse. The official exchange rate was 6.3 bolivars per dollar. The black market rate was 60, a 10-to-1 gap. Anyone with government connections could get dollars at the official rate and sell them at the black market rate for massive profit. Some estimates suggest hundreds of billions of dollars were lost through this system over the years, though the exact figure is disputed. What's not disputed is the effect. Insiders were becoming billionaires while the country starved. International reserves, the dollars Venezuela held to pay for imports, collapsed. $22 billion in January 2015 fell to $11 billion by December 2016. The country was running out of dollars, running out of the ability to buy food and medicine from abroad, and the government's response was to print more bolivars and tighten controls. GDP began contracting, negative 3% in 2014, negative 5.7% in 2015, negative 17% in 2016. The economy was shrinking fast. Real GDP per capita fell 30% between 2013 and 2016. Venezuelans were getting poorer by the day, but the worst was yet to come. In November 2016, Venezuela officially entered hyperinflation. Hyperinflation has a specific definition: prices rising more than 50% per month for 30 consecutive days. Venezuela crossed that threshold in late 2016 and wouldn't exit for 3 years. It became the 57th country in history to experience hyperinflation, but unlike most hyperinflations that burn out quickly, Venezuela's would last 37 to 40 months, the third longest in world history after Nicaragua and Greece. And here's the second puzzle. Why did this hyperinflation last years instead of months? The answer reveals something darker than simple policy failure. Let me show you how money dies. Venezuela's central bank later reported annual inflation of 130,060% in 2018 and 9,586% in 2019. But the IMF, using independent data, projected even higher figures. Over 1 million percent for 2018, 10 million percent for 2019. By April of 2019, the central bank admitted cumulative inflation since 2016 had reached 53,798,500%. But forget the numbers for a moment. Let me show you what this looked like in practice. You get paid at lunch, you leave work immediately and rush to the store. The chicken that cost 1 million bolivars this morning now costs 2 million. You buy it anyway because tomorrow it might be 3 million. Store owners stopped using price tags. They wrote prices on chalkboards and erased them constantly, sometimes hourly, sometimes more often than that. Cash registers couldn't handle the numbers. Calculators didn't have enough digits. People started carrying money in bags, weighing stacks of bills because counting them took too long. A coffee cost 500,000 bolivars. A loaf of bread, 2 million. Workers were paid twice a day so they could spend their wages before they lost value. This is what it means when money stops working. Not slowly, not gradually, all at once. The entire concept of money as a store of value collapsed. Money was now purely a medium of exchange, and only if you exchanged it fast enough. Hold it for a day and you lost half your purchasing power. Hold it for a week and it was worthless. The government tried to cope by removing zeros from the currency. In 2008, they created the Bolivar Fuerte, removing 3 zeros. In August 2018, they created the Bolivar Soberano, removing 5 more zeros. In October 2021, they created the Bolivar Digital, removing 6 more zeros. 14 zeros total removed from the currency. 1 digital bolivar in 2021 equaled 100 trillion original bolivars from before 2008. The currency had been destroyed, redenominated 3 times, and was still nearly worthless. The central bank ran out of paper to print money. Venezuela's mint couldn't keep up with inflation. They were literally printing bills that became worthless before they finished printing them. The government ordered billions in banknotes from foreign printers. They couldn't print fast, enough to supply the currency needs of an economy where prices were doubling weekly. And then society adapted. When the official currency stops working, people find alternatives. Dollars started circulating on the black market. Not legally, but nobody cared about legal anymore. If you had dollars, you had real money. Shopkeepers would quote prices in dollars, then convert to bolivars at that day's black market rate. The dollar became the shadow currency, the one that actually held value. Cryptocurrency found a foothold. Venezuela became one of the top countries for Bitcoin adoption, not because Venezuelans loved technology, but because anything was better than the bolivar. Some people turned to barter, trading goods for goods, eggs for rice, services for food. The economy regressed centuries in a matter of years. This is how society adapts when money dies. They replace it. And here's the answer to that second puzzle. Why did Venezuela's hyperinflation last years instead of burning out in months, like most? Because the government couldn't stop printing. In most hyperinflations, the government eventually loses the ability to spend, runs out of things to sell, and the printing stops. In Venezuela, oil kept flowing. Not as much as before, but enough to give the government something to sell for real currency. Enough to keep the regime functioning. Enough to delay the reckoning. The oil was both Venezuela's blessing and its curse. It made the country rich. Then it allowed the government to destroy that wealth slowly instead of all at once. But adaptation has limits. You can replace the currency. You can barter. You can find workarounds. But you can't adapt your way out of starvation. This is where society breaks. The minimum wage became a cruel joke. In April 2012, Venezuela's minimum wage was $476 per month, rising to $700 with food vouchers, one of the highest in Latin America. By March 2015, it had fallen to $20 to $31 per month at black market rates. By January 2019, $5.50. By 2020, effectively $1 to $3 per month. Venezuela had the lowest minimum wage in the world. A worker earning minimum wage received less than 4 cents per day. Professional salaries collapsed alongside it. Teachers, doctors, engineers, people with advanced degrees were earning $10 or $15 per month. Not enough to feed a family for a week. The human toll became visible. In 2016 and 2017, Food shortages became so severe that Venezuelans called it the Maduro diet. Surveys showed 74.3% of the population lost weight in 2016, averaging 8.7 kilograms per person, 19 pounds. In 2017, 64% lost an average of 11 kilograms, 24 pounds. People were starving. They ate wild fruit, scavenged garbage, killed flamingos and anteaters for meat. Parents fed children only bananas for days. The average caloric intake fell below basic nutritional requirements. Malnutrition became widespread. Food insecurity reached crisis levels. By 2019 to 2020, 96.3% of households lived in income poverty. Only 3% were food secure. The scarcity index for basic goods exceeded 80%. Rice, flour, cooking oil, sugar, all disappeared from shelves. Government clap food boxes, delivered irregularly, became the primary food source for millions. Families that had been middle class were digging through trash for scraps. The healthcare system collapsed. Medicine shortages hit 85% by January 2017. Hospital operating rooms were 50% non-functional. Diseases that had been eradicated returned. Malaria cases exploded from 36,000 in 2009 to 414,000 by 2017. Diphtheria, which had 0 cases from 2006 to 2015, surged to 2,500 suspected cases. Maternal mortality rose 65% in 2016 alone. Infant mortality increased 30%. Over 22,000 physicians fled the country between 2012 and 2017. Hospitals had no antibiotics, no anesthesia, no basic supplies. Patients died from treatable conditions because the medicine didn't exist. Infrastructure breakdown culminated in March 2019 with a nationwide blackout. Starting March 7th, the largest power outage in Venezuelan history lasted over 96 hours in Caracas and up to 7 days in other states. All 23 states plus the capital district lost power. At least 43 deaths were directly attributed to the blackout. Hospitals lost power. Life support systems failed. Food spoiled nationwide. Water pumps stopped. Electronic payments became impossible. The grid, under-maintained for years, had finally collapsed. This was the physical manifestation of economic decay. The country literally went dark, and people fled. 7.9 million Venezuelans have left their country since 2014, 23% of the population. This is one of the largest displacement crises in modern history. The exodus accelerated during the worst years. 1 million had left by 2017, 3 million by November 2018, 6 million by the end of 2019. By October 2022, 7.1 million. Colombia hosts the largest number, over 2.9 million. Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, Chile, the United States, Spain, all absorbed hundreds of thousands. Families walked for weeks across borders with their belongings. They left because daily life had become impossible. No food, no medicine, no electricity, no hope. The country had become unlivable. The exodus tells stories that statistics can't capture. Doctors who'd trained for years working as Uber drivers in Bogota, engineers washing dishes in Lima, teachers selling empanadas on street corners in Quito, families separated, parents sending remittances back to children left with grandparents because they couldn't afford to bring everyone, young people walking the treacherous Darien Gap through Panama, risking death for a chance at asylum. Venezuelans became visible across Latin America, begging at intersections, sleeping in parks, trying to survive. The wealthy countries that had once envied Venezuela's oil wealth now saw its citizens as refugees, economic migrants, problems to be managed. The reversal was complete and devastating. Throughout all of this, the debate over sanctions intensified. The Venezuelan government blamed U.S. economic warfare for the collapse. The opposition and international observers pointed to years of mismanagement. The truth is more complex. Initial individual sanctions began in March 2015 under Obama, targeting specific officials for human rights abuses. These had minimal economic impact. More significant financial restrictions came in August 2017 under Trump, prohibiting Venezuela and PDVSA from accessing U.S. financial markets for new debt. This made borrowing harder, but the economic crisis was already severe. The most consequential sanctions arrived in January 2019. The Treasury Department designated PDVSA, freezing approximately $7 billion in U.S.-based assets and blocking oil payments. This effectively cut off Venezuela's primary revenue source from the U.S. market. Secondary sanctions in August 2019 froze all Maduro government assets in the United States. 2020 sanctions targeted Rosneft subsidiaries, helping Venezuela evade restrictions. Did sanctions cause the collapse? No. The collapse was already underway. Oil production had already fallen from 2.5 million barrels per day in 2014 to 1.5 million by 2017. A 50% drop before major sanctions existed. Hyperinflation was already raging. GDP had already contracted severely. Food shortages were already catastrophic. But did sanctions make things worse? Yes. After January 2019, oil production accelerated its decline from 1.5 million barrels per day to 830,000 by April 2019. The COVID-19 pandemic and secondary sanctions pushed production to just 337,000 barrels per day in June 2020, an 89% decline from the 2000 peak. Expert economists generally conclude that Venezuela would have experienced severe crisis without sanctions, but sanctions accelerated and deepened the collapse. Francisco Rodriguez, a Venezuelan economist, assessed that without sanctions, Venezuela would have experienced a large economic crisis, similar to other Latin American crises, but not the catastrophic collapse that occurred. The UN Special Rapporteur noted that Venezuela's decline began in 2014 with falling oil prices, and that mismanagement and corruption had also contributed significantly. Sanctions poured gasoline on a fire that was already burning. Venezuela sought help from international allies. China had provided an estimated $60 to $105 billion in loans for oil deals between 2007 and 2016, but lending largely stopped after 2016 when China realized the money wasn't coming back. Russia invested approximately $9 to $17 billion through Rosneft and provided military equipment worth over $4 billion. Iran became crucial for sanctions evasion, sending fuel shipments. 5 tankers with 1.5 million barrels in May 2020, receiving payment in gold through shadow fleet operations. These partnerships helped Maduro survive, but couldn't reverse the collapse. By late 2021, hyperinflation finally ended. Not because the government fixed it, but because there was nothing left to destroy. Venezuela technically exited hyperinflation after 12 consecutive months with monthly inflation below 50%, ending in January 2022. But this wasn't success. The bolivar had become so worthless that the government could no longer effectively tax through money printing. Real bolivar money demand had collapsed to just $1.1 billion, less than 2% of GDP. The central bank imposed 100% reserve requirements in January 2019, effectively stopping bank lending. Government spending collapsed from 33.8% of GDP from 2012 to 2018 to 22.3% from 2019 to 2021, a 73% real decline. Hyperinflation ended because the currency had been destroyed and there was nothing left to inflate. From 2014 to 2021, Venezuela's economy contracted approximately 75%. That's worse than the Great Depression. That's worse than what most countries experienced during war. And it happened during peacetime. What replaced the bolivar was the dollar. De facto dollarization took over. By 2024, an estimated 60 to 80% of all transactions occurred in US dollars. The government that had once called dollarization unconstitutional quietly embraced it as an escape valve. Venezuelans access dollars through remittances, 3 to 4.2 billion annually sent by family abroad. They use cryptocurrency exchanges. Venezuela ranked third globally for grassroots crypto adoption. They trade in informal markets. The bolivar still exists officially, but in practice, the dollar is the currency of the economy. Current inflation has fallen to approximately 60% annually as of 2024. Still extremely high by any normal standard, but a dramatic improvement from millions of percent. The economy has grown modestly, 15 to 17% in 2022, 4 to 5% in 2023, 3 to 5% in 2024. But this growth is from catastrophic depths. GDP remains at roughly 30% of its 2013 level. The UN estimates it would take over 30 years of sustained growth at recent rates just to return to pre-crisis levels. Oil production has partially recovered to approximately 900,000 to 921,000 barrels per day in 2024. This is driven largely by Chevron's operations under limited U.S. licenses granted in November 2022. It's nearly triple the June 2020 low, but still far below pre-crisis levels and a fraction of historical capacity. Restoring full capacity would require an estimated $58 to $100 billion in infrastructure investment. Money Venezuela doesn't have. Poverty remains catastrophic. 82% of the population lives in poverty according to 2023 to 2024 surveys, 50 to 53% in extreme poverty. The minimum wage remains effectively worthless at $3 to $4 per month, while the basic food basket costs $500. 82% of the population experiences food insecurity. 70% lack adequate water access. The social fabric has been shredded. An entire generation has grown up in crisis. Children born in 2014 are now 10 or 11 years old. They've never known anything but shortages, blackouts, and hunger. Many missed years of school. Malnutrition during critical developmental years will have lifelong effects. The educated middle class fled. Doctors, engineers, teachers, professionals, gone. What remains is a hollowed-out society, dependent on remittances and informal dollars, governed by a regime that has lost all economic credibility. The lessons of Venezuela's collapse are clear but often ignored. First, no amount of natural resource wealth can compensate for bad policy. Venezuela had the largest oil reserves on Earth and still became the poorest country in the hemisphere. Resources don't create prosperity. Institutions and policies do. Saudi Arabia has oil. Norway has oil. Both are wealthy. The difference isn't the resource, it's what you do with the revenue. Second, price controls destroy supply. Always, without exception. When you make it unprofitable to produce something, people stop producing it. Then you have shortages, then you have rationing, then you have hunger. Venezuela fixed bread prices, trying to help the poor afford food. The result was no bread in stores and families going hungry. The road to famine was paved with good intentions and bad economics. Third, currency controls create corruption and capital flight. When you fix exchange rates below market value, you create arbitrage, opportunities that drain reserves and enrich insiders while destroying the economy. Venezuela lost vast sums to currency arbitrage. That money could have built infrastructure, funded education, diversified the economy. Instead, it lined the pockets of regime insiders who got cheap dollars and sold them at black market rates. Fourth, money printing is theft. Every bolivar created to pay government bills was a tax on everyone holding bolivars. The value was stolen silently through inflation. Workers saw their salaries become worthless. Retirees saw pensions evaporate. Savers saw their life's work turn to nothing. This wasn't accidental, it was policy. The government chose to confiscate value through inflation rather than cut spending. Fifth, political control of economic institutions destroys them. You can't run a complex technical operation with political loyalty as the primary qualification. Physics and geology don't care about your party membership. Wells don't produce oil because you support the regime. Technical expertise matters, and when you purge it for political reasons, production collapses. Central bank independence matters for the same reason. When the government can print money at will, it will. And finally, the collapse happens slowly, then all at once. Venezuela's crisis built over years. The price controls in 2003, the PDVSA purge in 2003, the mounting deficits through the 2010s, the accelerating money printing after 2014. Each step seemed manageable. Each problem seemed temporary. But the effects accumulated and compounded until the system collapsed. This is the part that's hardest to see in real time. When you're living through it, each year seems like it might be the bottom. Each policy change seems like it might work. You normalize decline, you adapt to shortages, you get used to inflation, and then one day you wake up and your country doesn't function anymore in 7.9 million. People have left and the currency has been redenominated 3 times and you're eating once a day if you're lucky. This is the hidden lesson most countries ignore. They think they can run deficits just a little longer, print money just a little more, control prices just on essentials, fix exchange rates just temporarily. Each policy in isolation seems reasonable, but economics is about interactions and second-order effects. The price controls that seem humanitarian create shortages. The currency controls that seem necessary create black markets. The money printing that seems expedient creates inflation. And once you're on the path, it's very hard to step off because each policy creates problems that seem to require more intervention. Venezuela's path from prosperity to catastrophe took about a decade from the height of the boom to the depths of hyperinflation. 10 years, 1 generation. Fast enough that people remember when things worked, slow enough that each step seemed survivable. The government promised the problems were temporary. Foreign enemies, speculators, economic war, always someone else's fault, never the policies. By the time reality became undeniable, it was too late. The productive capacity was destroyed. The reserves were gone. The currency was worthless. And 7.9 million people had voted with their feet by fleeing. Today, Venezuela exists in a strange twilight state, not quite recovered, not still collapsing. The economy grows slightly, but remains devastated. Dollarization has brought some stability, but only for those who have dollars. The poor, the vast majority, survive on remittances and clap boxes. The government maintains control through repression and the fact that anyone with the means and will to oppose them has left. Oil flows again, slowly, funded by Chevron. But the country that was once rich, that once had the highest standard of living in South America, that once attracted immigrants, is now a cautionary tale. The world should pay attention. The policies that destroyed Venezuela exist elsewhere, usually in less extreme form. Price controls, currency interventions, deficit spending financed by central banks, resource dependence without diversification. Each country thinks it's different, that it can manage these tools better, that it won't make Venezuela's mistakes. That's what Venezuela thought too. They had the oil, they had the wealth, they had the revenue. And they destroyed it all, one policy at a time, because they believed the rules didn't apply to them. The lesson isn't that hyperinflation is inevitable, it's that it's always a choice, a series of choices. Venezuela chose money printing over fiscal discipline, price controls over market signals, currency controls over capital freedom, political loyalty over technical expertise. And the cumulative effect of those choices was the destruction of an entire economy. 53 million % inflation, 75%, GDP collapse, 7.9 million refugees. A country that exists now as a warning written in the suffering of millions about what happens when you ignore economics because you think you're different. You're not different. The math doesn't care, and Venezuela proved it. If this opened your eyes to how economies collapse, one policy at a time, over years that feel survivable until suddenly they're not, subscribe. Because the pattern is always the same. The warnings are always ignored. And history keeps teaching the same lesson to countries that think they're too big, too rich, too special to fail.